Hi, Jim.
Say again, Jim.
Good morning.
Beautiful. All right, good. So, through the magic of, I think, Skype, sorry, Link.
It's on our phone now.
Jim is here. So I'm going to introduce Jim, and then John and Laura, and then what we'll do is we'll have Jim was going to present an overview of a recent report that he and his colleague wrote that is probably one of the best overviews of the scholarly literature on broadband demand. What are the factors that go into it? And then, again, probably the best overview, scholarly overview of the kinds of programs and how they work. Then I will talk for probably 10 or 15 minutes, probably 10 minutes, laying out the results of a new report that we're releasing today that makes 8 recommendations for the federal government to consider to boost broadband demand. And then we'll hear from John and Laura as respondents. So let me start off with Jim. Jim Krieger is a professor in the School of Public Policy at Pepperdine University. He's been there since 2006. Prior to that, he was, or also has been a senior staff economist at the Federal Communications Commission and was assistant professor of economics at UC Davis. He has a number of outstanding awards and a large array of articles and in referee journals and book chapters. Next, we'll hear from Laura Taylor. Laura is Chief Policy Officer for Connected Nation. Most of you know Connected Nation. It's a national group that focuses on broadband deployment and adoption. And she works with public and private sectors to build partnerships for actionable research and public policy to accelerate the growth and adoption of technology and support of community and economic development. Prior to joining Connected Nation, Laura served as a legislative analyst and for the Kentucky Legislative Research Commission. And lastly, John Horrigan. Most of you know John. John is probably, if we're really being wonky, we would call him Mr. Broadband Data. John really probably knows more about broadband data than anyone else, certainly in this country. He is now the Consumer Research Director for the FCC's Broadband Task Force, and we really appreciate John taking time out of his busy schedule, because I think this next 6 weeks is probably going to be very intense for the task force and then putting together their final recommendations of the report. Before joining the task force, I guess this summer, he had been with the Pew Internet Project, where he did all of the really great research that they did in explaining and understanding Internet and broadband usage. He was also a staff officer at the Board of Science, Technology, and Economic Policy at the National Research Council, and received his PhD in public policy from UT Austin. So with that, Jim, do you want to kick it off and describe the results and findings of your report?
Okay. Well, thank you, Rob. Thank you and ITF for organizing this event. And I think it is quite fitting that given our topic of broadband, that I am able to participate in a way that certainly 20 years ago we couldn't have, and 10 years ago would have been a whole lot harder than it is today. So this is joint work with Janice Howdy, professor from University of North Texas. And presuming that you're looking at the first PowerPoint slide, I'm going to let you guess whether that's Denton, Texas, or Malibu, California. So we also do want to thank AT&T for providing some financial support for this project. However, I do want to be very clear, all of these conclusions are our own. Okay, you can go to the next slide. So the purpose of our report is to examine demand-side programs that are intended to stimulate broadband adoption. So in particular, what we're doing here is we're looking at the evidence available on how well these programs have fulfilled their purpose. Now, we're not conducting these evaluations ourselves. There are hundreds of programs that we ran across. What we did was try to look for studies that have been done, quality studies that have been done that get at the question, how well do these demand-side programs work? So our focus is on quantitative evaluations. We're really looking for evaluations that seek to measure the causal impact that these programs might have had on the adoption of broadband. And we really do try to cover every program evaluation that we could find in the area of broadband adoption. So as you can imagine, this was a very big project, and there is a paper that you can find on SSRN, and probably link to from the ITIF website. Just to be clear right at the beginning, I want to say a little bit about what we don't do. First of all, we're not going to be looking at the supply side or the infrastructure deployment side. Based on economics, which said that supply creates some demand, was disproven 100 years ago. So we view the supply side as a separate issue. We also in this report don't comment on whether broadband for all is a worthy goal. It's just not what we're looking at. So instead, what we're going to do is to take it as a fact that it seems to be the policy goal at the moment. And given that we do have a national plan being developed by the FCC, what we're going to do is ask what works. Okay, so on the next slide, we begin by discussing the several general types of initiatives designed to stimulate broadband demand. And what we did here to organize these many, many programs that we found is we relied on some of the good work done by John and others at Pew, where they identified several types of barriers to broadband adoption. And what we did is we categorized programs by which of these barriers they seek to address. So first of all, the first barrier that many programs, or that some programs try to get at, is the price of broadband service itself. Now, of course, the most direct way to bring down the price of broadband service through a policy program would be to subsidize broadband service itself, or to do it through tax credits. Now, there aren't many general subsidy programs that we found, particularly in the US, we don't have those. There are some examples of tax credits being used to bring down the price of broadband, mostly from Europe. Also, a tempting way in this country where taxes on telecommunications services are very high might be to think about bringing down the price through reducing taxes on broadband service. It's a more indirect way to bring the price down, but some countries have done this. For example, we found out that France has at least for a while, had a value-added tax rate of only 5.5% on broadband services, whereas the general VAT rate was more like 20%. Okay, the second barrier that some programs go after is lack of computer ownership. The idea being that most people access the internet through computers, and if you don't have a computer, that leaves you out. Groups that have gone after this goal would be groups like Wireless Philadelphia's Digital Inclusion Project. I believe that group has now renamed itself Digital Impact Group. Zero Divide in California would be another example of this sort of program. The third barrier is lack of digital literacy, which is the more pervasive problem that gets at the notion that some people just don't understand how all this works and aren't able to use the technology even if it were handed to them. Programs that do general awareness, technology awareness campaigns would fit into this category. General awareness campaigns about broadband, perhaps not needed so much anymore, certainly not as common now as they were in past years. But technology awareness campaigns still seem to be an important part of certain programs. For example, Connected Nations e-community broadband planning methodology makes use of awareness campaigns. A community technology center would be another example of a type of program. For example, the technology center is set up by the group Net Literacy. I'll go after that third barrier. The fourth barrier is a little tougher, and this is the barrier where people say they just don't see the value proposition in broadband. They don't want to subscribe, they don't think it's worth it. So any program that gets at education about broadband is really going after this barrier. And for consumers, we don't see so many examples of just plain old education about broadband in the United States nearly as much as we did in Europe, particularly in earlier years. In the US, of course, there hasn't been a national policy to do this. The policy was basically to let the market educate consumers about the technology, as we did with good success with many other technologies like fax machines and cell phones. However, even in the US, there have been some programs that have done this for particular groups. For example, small businesses. Ohio had a program that was funded apparently only for 1 year, a couple of years ago, called Ohio eVantage, that went out to small businesses, and you can well imagine that several small business owners might understand how to use broadband personally, but not really understand what it can do for them in their business life. And so there are various policies that can address that barrier. To raise demand, there are all sorts of things that have been floated out there in policy papers and so forth. For example, e-government is often mentioned as an example that can stimulate demand. And this seems a bit more like wishful thinking to us than something that would actually raise someone's demand, in the sense that, if I can get an online streamed viewing of a local city council meeting, is that by itself really going to make me run out and get broadband, particularly if that's already available on some local cable channel? Maybe not. There are many other policies affecting the quality of broadband service, and anything that affects the quality of broadband service, of course, should eventually affect demand as well, although the links might be quite indirect. For example, any policy that affects congestion ultimately will affect user experience and can affect demand. Okay, the fifth category of program is the type of program that goes after many of these barriers at once. And one of the things that we'll come to in our conclusion sections is that the programs that seem to work best are the ones that tackle many barriers at once to try to actually get people to use broadband in a realistic way. Groups like Connected Nation, like Digital Impact Group, many other of these sorts of groups are more holistic programs that try to go after whatever it is in the local community that might be preventing broadband access. For example, some of these groups will give participating households a computer, they'll give broadband access to the household, they'll provide training, support, follow-up. These sorts of programs really try to go after all of these barriers at once. Okay, so on the next slide, what we want to do is just give you a little bit of what we did and what we found in terms of reviewing these evaluations. Now, unfortunately, let me first just comment generally on what we found before I talk about any specific programs. The most important finding, and a bit surprising to us, was actually how thin the literature is on evaluating these broadband demand stimulation programs. And here I do want to say we're approaching this from the standpoint of academics, and so we first were looking at academic literature, and we very quickly realized that it would be a very short paper if we stopped with purely academic papers. So we did cast a wider net than we would otherwise do. But it's interesting to note, just compare this to one other topic, for example. So if the topic of this report were programs for poverty relief in the United States, we would be able to find article after article in academic literature using state-of-the-art econometric techniques, analyzing a variety of programs, and there would be quite a wealth of experience and knowledge that's been gained about how well these programs work. There's nothing like that for the world of these broadband demand stimulation programs. It just really hasn't been taken up in a systematic way yet. And so part of what we would do is call for a lot more research in this area. For the evaluations that we did find, particularly because many of them are done in a more ad hoc sort of way, the biggest pitfall is really the assumption of causation. In other words, the ad hoc fallacy. Now, what I mean here is that many so-called evaluations list what a program did in a particular geographical area, a particular city, then they list how much broadband increased in that area, and then they just claim or assume that the program was necessarily responsible for all of that growth in broadband demand. Now, the basic problem with this is that broadband in the United States has generally been increasing everywhere. Broadband and penetration rates really never go down. Even in the time of the recent recession, in the past year or so, broadband take-up rates have remained pretty steady. People really don't give up their broadband. So in a background where broadband is rising pretty much everywhere, the real question for policy is how much additional broadband stimulus was provided by the program. In other words, you have to net out what would have happened in the absence of the program. And most evaluations that we found don't even address that question. And I want to be very clear here. To point out the ad hoc fallacy in some of these evaluations is definitely not to say that we don't think the programs worked or that they're not good programs. We just want to point out that you can't assume causality. You actually have to do some work to show that. And our criticism here is really of the evaluations, not of the programs. Okay, so on the next slide, what I want to do is just walk you through the meat of the report, which are specific reviews on various programs. And given the time frame available this morning, I'm not going to talk about a lot of specific results regarding specific programs. I just want to hit the big areas that we found. Okay, so first, the large national plans. Now, here we're thinking of nations like Korea and Sweden that had top-down efforts to spur broadband deployment, often a long time before we thought about doing this in this country. And here, we quickly realized that this is a very complicated question. For every Korea, which looks like a great success, there is a Singapore, a la 2002. As of 2002, Singapore had had a top-down national initiative and program in place, but didn't really have much to show for it yet. Since then, they've had very good success. But it became clear that it's not just a matter of if you have a plan, necessarily it's going to work. And even in the Korean case, there are a variety of commentators out there with varying opinions on it. I mean, the thing that seems clear about a place, an experience like the Korean one, is that if you overinvest in fiber, like they did very early, you're going to end up with a glut of fiber, an excess of supply, and you will have very low prices. And of course, that's great for demand. The unanswered question about the Korean experience that we didn't see fully addressed in any study is the question of cost-benefit analysis. You used a large part of society's resources to put that fiber into place. It spurred a lot of demand, but what's the net social benefit? That appears to remain unaddressed. Next, we looked at state-level programs. And these are the good programs done by folks like Connected Nation in many different states, and the ENC Authority, North Carolina Authority, another state-level program. And here, what we found, somewhat to our surprise, given how prominent some of these programs are, is that we really didn't find external analyses of these programs. So it's definitely a fruitful area of research. And for the evaluations that we could find for some of these programs, a lot of the same problems show up in terms of being able to be confident about what's going on with causality, as in the national reviews. So for example, nearly uniformly, there was no control group in these sorts of evaluations. There's no sense of a random experiment or of following households that didn't partake in the program. There's really no attempt to try to net out what would have happened in the absence of the program. And there's also little attempt to try to recognize the fact that this program was not necessarily the only thing going on in the state. For example, some of these states received a lot of money from the E-rate program as well. And if children are learning how to use computers and the internet at school, perhaps that also is affecting demand for broadband at home. So there are a variety of factors going on, and we haven't yet seen a really good study that tries to tease out the impacts of all those different factors. Okay, next are the local level plans. These are the plans that often target one city, or many times even just one disadvantaged neighborhood in a city. Digital Inclusion Project, an example of this. One Economy does this in various places. Zero Divide does this in California. Now, these evaluations, as you can well imagine, since many of these groups are actually quite small, just local advocacy groups and so forth, these evaluations tend to be of varying quality, let's just put it that way. One of the problems is they're often filled with very vague claims that would be impossible to quantify. For example, quoting from one of these reports, you'll find claims that our program promoted economic development, built community assets, empowered communities, and spurred civic action. Well, that sounds really good. It may be what the donors want to hear. It may even be true, but it doesn't really help you know if the money spent on the project was worth it when you can state these things without really being specific about them. Things like that are much easier to state than to prove. Now, when quantifiable outcomes are included in some of these evaluations of the local level reports, the programs often look very impressive. For example, Wireless Philadelphia, the digital impact group, seems to have really good success in low-income households, getting them online, getting them to use computers, and so forth. However, even here, the academic in us has to point out that there's still the problem of what's called selection bias. And this is not a randomly selected group of people that participated in your program. They all chose to be part of the program. That means they were motivated, at least at some level, and wanted to get broadband and to learn how to use it. Now, it doesn't mean that the program didn't work, just to say that there's selection bias, but the implication is that you can't make any claims about, well, what if we funded your project at 10 times its current scale? The results might not scale up. If the most motivated people were the first ones that joined your program, you probably had the best success at the beginning. So that's the impact, selection bias. Okay, finally, we looked at lessons that we can learn from evaluations of subsidy programs. And here we started with looking at the existing universal service programs on the demand side for narrowband communication. So this would be at the federal level, the Lifeline and Link-Up programs. And there were several interesting results here. For example, with Lifeline, some of the studies done in particular states like Florida showed that it can be surprisingly hard to get some of your target households to actually take up the program. In other words, there are lots of households who, for whatever reason, qualified for the program, but just don't take advantage of it. Perhaps they feel need it, perhaps there's a stigma of being involved in something that's considered a welfare program. There are various things that have been, reasons that have been advanced there. Another subsidy program that we looked at, and probably the best study of academic quality that we found, was on the E-rate program. And this is the program, the federal program, that funds schools and libraries to get connected to the internet. It funds telecommunications infrastructure and things like inside wiring inside schools. Austin Goolsby and one of his co-authors looked at the experience of California and the impact that the E-rate had on internet connectivity and educational outcomes in that state. Now, the nice thing that they do that nearly every study did not do is they actually said, what's the value added of this program? And using a variety of good econometric methods, they were able to show that the predicted classroom internet connection rate would have been 40% without the program, whereas with the E-rate program, during the same time, the connection rate, it was 66%. So there was a gain of about 26 percentage points there. Seems to be a good impact of the program in terms of internet connectivity. However, the interesting thing is in their report is that when they look at the impact on educational outcomes, they find no difference between schools that are wired and schools that weren't. Come back to that point in a moment. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. And advance that slide on this end as well. Okay, so our overall findings. So at this point, we had hoped to have found several very good evaluations of programs to show what worked so that we could provide really specific recommendations and conclusions. Unfortunately, due to the lack of really good studies, we have to be a bit more general in our findings. But certain conclusions do appear to be supported by the experience that is out there. Our first point is that given the multiplicity of barriers to broadband adoption, we found that a successful program appears to have to tackle many goals at once. For example, go back to that last study that I mentioned about the E-rate in California. Maybe the increased internet connectivity in schools didn't improve educational outcomes because in many of those schools, teachers weren't trained to use the technology. Perhaps they weren't taught how to use it and to integrate it into the classroom. Perhaps the school didn't have enough computers. Maybe the kids just weren't being exposed to whatever benefits they could have received very much because the program only very narrowly targeted getting the infrastructure in place. So you have to, it appears that you have to tackle multiple barriers at once. Groups like Connected Nation and so forth do that. Encouraging broadband adoption is only part of a larger digital literacy effort, I guess is the way to summarize that point. Programs work when they make non-users want to connect, when they make the internet cheaper, and when they adjust to users' preferences in the local community. On the next slide, we want to just talk a little bit about the scale of a program, because we covered programs from the large national scale all the way down to the small pilot project in the community. And there are definite strengths and weaknesses of both of those approaches. And probably what we want to have in a national plan is something that combines the strengths of both of those. So first of all, starting with the nationally funded programs.
Jim, this is Rob. Could you wrap up in about 3 or 4 minutes?
Yes, I can.
Beautiful, thank you. Still
Okay.
run over time.
With the national programs, the problem that we have with some of the programs like E-rate is that, quite frankly, there's been apparently a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse. And when you have a program funded in DC, but the money is being spent far away from DC, that seems to be a natural problem that you have to deal with. On the other hand, when local governments or community organizations are involved, then typically they're able to begin with a more complete knowledge of what the barriers to adoption are in the community. So local organizations might be better at that. The disadvantages of the purely local efforts have to do with their more limited capabilities to collect and analyze the right sort of data to truly evaluate their project. The national programs may be better at that. Okay, moving on to the next slide, which is our last one. We wanted to conclude by giving our suggestions based on our findings, and the backdrop here being that we do have, of course, a national broadband plan being formulated. What are our suggestions for it? Well, the first is just that we would hope that cost-benefit analysis would be a standard part of any program review, because this is what was most missing, or the most obvious thing that was missing from many of these project evaluations. You can find many evaluations filled with phrases like, digital inclusion is priceless. Well, that's not really helpful when we're determining priorities and where to spend our broadband dollars. We also want to push for rigorous program evaluation, certainly much more than has been done in the past. For example, evaluating a program doesn't mean that you say, we had a goal of distributing 100 laptops and we met that goal. If the ultimate goal is digital inclusion, you need to be looking at how people are using what you've given them and so forth. The final 2 points just have to do with what data you collect and how you analyze it. Now, clearly this mandate to collect data and to structure the program in such a way that you have control groups and so forth, that mandate has to come from above. I mean, hopefully these would be part of the strings attached with any federal funding. Our specific recommendation would be to use and create control groups where possible. Where not, there are econometric techniques that can help you figure out what's going on even in the absence of the control group. And so our final point is just to use the appropriate statistical methods, and without talking about what those are, I guess the simplest thing to say is, partner with folks in academia who are interested in this sort of thing, and who have PhD students who are looking for PhD thesis topics. It's a good source of cheap labor. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Jim. I'm reminded of pretty much every academic journal article that ends with next steps, fund more research. But in this case, it probably is a worthwhile thing to do. So I want to jump off from where Jim finished, which was trying to take a look at what do we know that works, and essentially say, look, we really don't know what works in sort of the way we might know what works in some other policy areas where we've had many, many more years of experience, data, and research. Unfortunately, John, I think isn't your report due like in February of next year?
That's right.
So we really don't have time to wait, ideally, until we find the perfect results. We have to act now. And with that in mind, let me make a few suggestions. I think it's pretty important that we focus on demand. About 95% of homes can get broadband, but only about 65% do. So boosting demand is critical. It's going to have all of these other public areas. I won't say it's priceless, but I will say it's important.
We never said that.
But it's important. It's not just important because of helping individuals whose lives will benefit, but it certainly has network effects. When more people are on the network, there are more applications that work. And it also has effects on the supply side. If a carrier is deciding to upgrade their network or to deploy a network in an area where there isn't broadband now, having an expectation of more customers makes that an investment with a higher rate of return and more likely to happen. Before I jump into a few specifics, ideas, or proposals, let me just sort of frame it by suggesting I guarantee when the FCC comes out with its report, and I guarantee it will have a section on broadband demand, and I guarantee it will have a section on policies. I also guarantee that it will be immediately criticized for saying, you know, look, this demand side thing, we don't really need to do anything about that. So just this week, there was a forum on the West Coast with some technology luminaries who weighed in on this. So Reed Hastings, who's the CEO of Netflix, he basically stated, we don't really have to worry about broadband demand because this is like all ubiquitous technologies like the telephone. Universal adoption is just going to happen. At the same meeting, Sergey Brin, the co-founder of Google, basically kind of chimed in with the same message. Don't worry about this. This internet is going to be like electricity. It'll be as easy and cheap as that. That would be great if either of those statements were true. I just don't think they are. And the reason they're not true is for a couple of reasons. One reason telephony became somewhat universal is that you really only needed to know 10 things, and that was 0 through 10. If you knew those numbers, you pretty much could call anywhere in the world, and you needed to be able to turn a dial. That was pretty simple technology. Today, computers, as improved as they have gotten, I don't know anybody who would say that a computer is a simple technology. It's a complicated technology. You know, error 404 message. Anybody know what that means? Why do they say things like that anyway? So the reason computers are complicated is because they're not a single-purpose device. If we wanted to create a single-purpose, remember those guys who were selling those email things? It was just a little thing, and all you could do was email. And I think they sold like 10 of those. Nobody wanted a thing that could just do email. People want a general-purpose device, i.e. a computer, because it means we can do this kind of thing with it. We can do everything with it. It just makes it harder to deal with. And for a lot of people, that's a difficult thing to figure out. So it's not going to happen on its own. Second piece of this is telephony didn't happen on its own. We had national policies to encourage that, including USF programs and Lifeline. Lastly, broadband is cheap as electricity. It actually is as cheap as electricity. I pay much, much more for my electricity than I pay for my broadband. But it still costs money, and I need electricity. And low-income people need electricity. They're like, you know what? I'm going to get rid of my electricity. I'm going to get broadband. You have to have electricity. You don't have to have broadband. So price actually there matters. So what do we need to do in terms of policies? As Jim alluded to, we really haven't done very much in the U.S. in terms of policies. We have E-rate, and that's pretty much about it. So I'm not going to, this report that we're issuing today doesn't really list every single policy one could imagine, but it lists a few that we think are the most important. And I also try to put those in a context of ones that aren't going to cost a lot of money, because unfortunately, for better or worse, we're in an environment where I don't think there's a big appetite for big public expenditures coming from the general fund. Having said that, I think we should invest a lot of money from the general fund in broadband demand policies. But I'm not Peter Orszag, and so I probably will not win that argument. What do we need to do? Let me start by saying I think the biggest and simplest idea that we can think of is a comprehensive, and it's a comprehensive idea, is to rely essentially on the power of the marketplace to do this. In this sense, what we propose is funding a competition among ISPs to see who can sign up the most broadband subscribers in low-income neighborhoods. Right now, you would imagine, well, they must have an incentive to do that, right? You want to sign up a customer because you get money. Well, figuring out how to sign up the customer is actually quite difficult because they're not just a customer who has a lot of money and knows how to use a computer and wants to do it. These are the kinds of customers who don't have as much money, they don't know that they want to use it, they don't have the skills to use it, and so it's a little bit more complicated. So under our proposal, what we would propose is that a program in NTIA Define eligible areas as low-income census tracts around the nation. ISPs would apply ahead of time to identify, report the number of their subscribers in each census tract if they want to compete in it. And then the service provider at the end of a year who has signed up the most new customers would get an award of $250 per customer. And only one award per census tract. So you can imagine, by the way, in most census tracts there are two providers today. We have provision that there's only one. And our view would be, anyway, so there'd be, we think, fairly intense competition between cable and DSL or fiber, and also now with WiMAX being deployed and other kind of wireless technologies. And also potentially ISPs that are competitive ISPs running on top of the network would also be able to participate. We would estimate that we could increase broadband adoption 5 percentage points, or if you increase broadband adoption 5 percentage points, it would cost $970 million as a one-time expenditure. I think there are two big advantages to this approach. One is it's comprehensive. Actually, there's three. One is it's comprehensive. Second, the expenditures are only made if new customers are signed up, so we have built-in accountability. The third is that it relies on market competition to have people out in the field figure out what the best way to do this. Some ISPs might say they're going to do novel payment plans like free computer. Others might have computer and training centers in their store, right in the neighborhood. Others might aggressively market Lifeline, if Lifeline were applied. Others might partner with third-party organizations like One Economy or Connected Nation or other groups. So I think in some ways that's what we think would be the most important and most effective proposal to drive broadband demand. So let me talk about some others which we think are also important. One is supporting innovative pricing plans among ISPs. You can say, well, why do we need to support that, and what's that all about? It's surprising to me that you can go to your local wireless company and you can get a free cell phone or a free or very low-cost PDA, BlackBerry or another device, and you pay for it over your 2-year contract. And there are also a wide variety of pricing plans, that are low-use pricing plans. There really isn't that in broadband. I don't know any company that's providing a free computer with broadband services. There are certainly some companies that have been criticized for providing, using bit pricing, bit caps. So you can imagine if the FCC came out and basically said, we think it's okay to bundle services and hardware and do long-term contracts, pricing contracts, and we think it's okay to do sort of low-use, low-price contracts, i.e. if you use less than a certain amount of bits every month, you don't pay that much, that would help with affordability. Clearly, it's time for Lifeline to be used for broadband. That's way, way overdue. At minimum, what we should be doing is giving consumers the choice of whether they want to use their Lifeline for fixed wireless, for POTS, for wireless, or for broadband. Why are we deciding that it should only be fixed line telephony? And another component of that is extend the internet tax moratorium. I know there are a lot of different studies that have different elasticities of demand. John, I'm talking about that for broadband. I'm going to cite Austin Gould because he was cited before in the White House, and obviously is the prim and authority on all this stuff. And Goolsbee finds that for every $1 of taxes on broadband, either wired or wireless, the society pays between $3.46 and $5.15 in loss. So in other words, this is an area where there are big economic losses to taxing broadband. So we need to, I would argue, extend the moratorium until at least 90% of Americans have subscribed. We should eliminate the grandfather clause, which I know that some in the States, that John may not agree with that, from NGA. We also need to clarify that the underlying transport service is a broadband service and should not be taxed. And we should ban discriminatory taxes on wireless, which are a huge barrier to adopting wireless broadband. Another thing I think we should be doing is we need to be focusing on defraying the cost, particularly for low-income families with children in schools. While the Goolsbee study found some conflicting or some questionable results, maybe with regard to E-rate impact, It actually is, there is some fair amount of evidence to suggest that people with an internet-connected computer at home, they have a better education performance for their children, controlling for socioeconomic status. And we go through all that literature in a report. It's on our website called Digital Quality of Life. There's an education chapter that reviews all that literature. But unfortunately, for low-income families making less than $30,000 a year, only half of those families own a PC. Less than half. So what we've proposed is a subsidy program where if you're a low-income family eligible for the E-rate, eligible for Lifeline, and you have a child under the age of 18, you would be eligible for a subsidy of up to $300 for a PC. And if we did that, we could essentially take about more than 10% of the E-rate funds and use those to support 1.5 million low-income households a year. Given the fact that the U.S. leads the OECD in connected classrooms now, broadly, that's the area, by the way, in the OECD, we're number one. And that's connected classrooms, and that's because of the E-rate. I think it's time to suggest that we need to broaden the focus of the E-rate program, not just to the classroom, to the family that are connected to it. Last couple of things we need to do a program we would argue is in NTIA that funds digital literacy programs. Jim alluded to a number of those around the country. Many of them are underfunded. And we should be also, I would argue, thinking about reinventing the TOP program. For those of you who remember, the Technology Opportunity Program was a program under Clinton, was eliminated under Bush. But I would argue we need to do that in a different way. The TOP worked at the time, but it was really a very sort of narrow program that worked on individual community projects. I don't really think that's what we should be doing anymore. I think TOP really needs to be focusing on big national projects that all would help all low-income communities or all disadvantaged populations. A case in point is what Canada has done. To me, this is a model. I don't know why we haven't done this in the U.S. I don't know why we just don't use license the program for Canada. But the Ontario Literacy Council created a program called Alpha Root, which is Alpha and then Root R-I-T-E. And it's an online literacy program. And you might say, well, geez, that's kind of strange. You need to be literate to be online. You actually don't, because this all has pictures and the word cat and dog and voice and all of that. And in studies of people who've used this program, they've actually found that their literacy level moves up one level of literacy. So literacy is defined, I think it's from 1 to 5, 5 being the most literate. People who go through this program move up one whole level just by using an online literacy training tool. These are the kinds of tools that we really need to be thinking about investing in at the national level, and that to me is what TOP could be really redesigned to do. So with that, let me just close and suggest that we're really excited that the FCC is doing a broadband plan. We're way overdue. Most other countries have already finished their plans and are long into implementation, but better late than never. And so we're, as I said, very optimistic that there will be a really strong broadband demand component in the plan. And I think if we do that, we can then expect that we'll be getting, instead of 65% of people on broadband, maybe within 5 years, we might be up to 80%, and then ultimately maybe in a decade up to 90%. So with that, I will turn it over to Laura.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, there you go. Thank you. Let's see if I can fit everything up here. Step forward, yeah. Okay. So, thanks, Rob, for those thoughtful comments, and thanks, Jim, for an excellent report. It's always good to see the new stuff that comes out, and particularly in this instance, because it's, as you mentioned, Rob, it's really, when it comes to the scarcity of reports that are out there that assess the demand side programs, we love to see them, good or bad, from Connected Nation standpoint, we love to see them. So it's great to see this comprehensive, this type of report on such a comprehensive level. And Rob, your latest report here, I think, provides some very creative and thoughtful recommendations on policy considerations that we all need to think about. And I think, Rob, that you've brought together a great mix today to kind of look at this issue, because we've got the world of academia, we've got the think tanks, we've got government, we've got the program implementers, we at Connected Nation, and others. And I think it's a great balance to have, to really look at how we can improve research to study the effectiveness of the programs that we implement, and then to move forward to improve those programs themselves through the research. So that's really the theme of my comments today, is that balance, trying to strike that balance. And we at Connected Nation are forced in many ways to look at the demand side programs that we implement with two different lenses. One, of course, is the research lens and the more quantitative lens, because it's important to us, and it always really has been a tenet of our programs, that we have research-based, data-driven programs from the outset, so that we can use that data for both program development as well as assessment. But then on the flip side, it's also critical for us, and we're really forced to, because we're out in the trenches and on the ground every day, to look at the real world assessment, or those real stories out there where we see how the programs are implemented and what it really means to children who are part of the after-school programs, where there are new computer labs in the housing developments, where children in the foster care system are able to use new computers through the Connected Nations and Connected Tennessee and Connected Ohio's computer ownership programs. All these things we can't ignore, and we see them every day. So we've got to have that balance as well in our assessment. Okay, so Jim talked about what he has found in his study that works. And I think one of the most interesting things, there are a number of interesting findings in this report, but perhaps one of the most interesting is that Jim and Janice focus on these barriers in a comprehensive way. And it's really the first time I've seen a report that hones in on the barriers themselves and uses those as the core of the report. We're big at Connected Nation on barriers, and I'll talk just a little bit about those. But what we have found that works is really similar, and I think echoes the Jim and Janice's findings, in that program development, we found that program development that is based on a holistic or comprehensive understanding of these barriers to computer and internet use across demographics. So digging down into those demographics to understand those barriers for each segment at both the macro and micro levels. Now for us, this has typically meant the state and local level. Now that we've got the National Broadband Plan under development, and this will, of course, bring it up to the federal level as well, which is great. And that enables the research-based programs that target specific populations for specific reasons with specific tactics. So that's what we're trying to get at with our research for program development. And then, of course, we've always found that local ownership and leadership of these programs is key to their success. I'm going to talk very quickly about, and I'm not going to spend much time on it because I don't have much time, because I could talk about Jim and Janice's findings all day. But one of the more interesting things, I think, is that computer ownership as a barrier, Jim and Janice find is a strong barrier, but they cite some of John Horgan's research when he was at Pew that cites computer ownership as maybe not quite as big of a barrier as we might have thought, which actually runs a bit counter to what we find when we do these surveys in the state. So this is taking Connected Tennessee as a case study here. When we look at the barriers to internet adoption among all residents who have no internet connection at all at home, lack of computer ownership is by far and away the biggest barrier. When we kind of take it down to just the broadband users, so we pull in those dial-up users, we find that the lack of computer ownership falls to second, and it's the lack of relevance or the lack of need that is really the strongest barrier, which again is consistent with a lot of Jim and Janice's findings. And then when we dig down into the barriers to computer ownership itself, so among those residents who don't have a home computer, why? Then lack of need becomes far and away the top barrier. 60% of those who don't own a computer say it's because they don't need one. Again, when we talk, I mentioned digging down into the demographics. This is key for us to dig down at the local level, to look at county level statistics as well as statistics across demographics, Because what we find is that there's a significant variance from, we just take race here, for example, between Caucasians and minorities. So the top barrier to broadband adoption among Caucasians is far and away lack of need, whereas with minorities, it's far and away lack of computer adoption. And then, of course, we're able to use these data all the way through the, from program start to finish to be able to assess. Now, as Jim mentioned, I'll fully admit that we don't always do the best job of looking at the causal agents and doing that full causal analysis, which we'd love to partner with with academia in the future to do. So what we typically do is just look at the more bivariate statistical analysis to look at correlations between the program implementation and then the adoption rates. So what we found in Tennessee over the course of the last 2 years is that we've seen great gains with African Americans, which was one of the groups targeted, so that's key. On the flip side, with other minorities, we've seen stagnant growth, so we've got some work to do there. So again, an example of how the research has helped us assess programs over time. I'll skip through a few of these, although there are some pretty significant findings, I think, in terms of how the programs correlate with the research itself and with the surveys. Finally, I want to address one of the points in Jim's report. He rightly makes the point that Connected Nation and other program implementers are not always the best at looking at or showing the percentage point growth, which we're perfectly willing to do, but to be quite frank, when we've got lack of space, we'll usually just show one bar for percentage growth instead of percentage point growth. So I wanted to just, if nothing else for Jim's sake, to throw up some percentages on the No Child Left Offline program in Kentucky to show some of the results there and maybe back up some of his findings and then give some of those results. So in Kentucky, we found that in the programs that implemented, or I'm sorry, in the counties that implemented the computer distribution program called No Child Left Offline, the gray bars represent the counties that did not participate. The red bars represent the counties that did participate. So pretty, significant growth here. What is that? 13 percentage point growth in low-income households with children, and this is computer ownership. This shows low-income households with children for internet adoption, and then low-income households with children for broadband adoption. The internet and broadband are probably the most interesting findings because, let's go back, because they show the most significant growth, and it would be indirectly related to the computer distribution program itself because we were distributing computers, but now we're seeing huge gains in internet and broadband adoption. That's pretty sustainable over the course of the 2 years. So there's your percentage point growth, Jim, just to give you a sense that we do look at that as well, and we're absolutely happy to show it. I want to mention very briefly a new program that we're using the results of these computer distribution programs that we have put together in both Tennessee and Ohio to work with partners such as Intel to put together a new program called Every Citizen Online, and it's a new concept, but it's based off of the research and the progress that we've seen made in these programs that have been ongoing for the last couple of years. And it's a concept where by bundled PCs, it's a bundled PC program, so bundled, it's a bundle with laptops and computers that are discounted computers and then bundled with a 12-month broadband discount. So it's a new concept, but it's built on the research that we've seen that these type of computer distribution programs work when they're targeted and when they're based on the initial statistical analysis and then the future research to come. So we're looking forward to working with Intel and the other partners on this, looking forward to working with partners in academia moving forward to measure these type of programs most effectively. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Laura. John?
thanks very much, Rob, for inviting me to be here. And let me start out by saying that I'm just going to make some observations that are my observations. They're not those of the FCC or the National Broadband Plan. Let me, in addition to thanking Rob for having me here, congratulate Jim on a very good piece of work. Really, I think this is a comprehensive and important work on the topic of broadband demand and how to stimulate it. So let me just make a few comments so that we can, I hope, get into a dialogue shortly about both Jim's piece and what Rob has put together in his report this morning. And it's a good thing that one of the slides that Jim put up was a bullet point that I wanted to hit on in my comments. And I found it compelling, the point in Jim's slides that said that if you want to promote broadband adoption, it has to be part of a broader digital literacy effort, one that makes non-users want to connect, which leads to the question, what makes users want to connect? I think if you're going to develop policy in this area, you really have to address that question. And I think part of the answer to that question is this notion of cultivating a social infrastructure around adoption and new adopters so that they really start to use the technology. So let me fill that out with a couple of stories. One comes from research I did many years ago in the early 90s when I was in graduate school in a project that looked at why people without telephones don't have telephones. If you want to find a summary of this study, I think it is still somewhere buried on the Alliance for Public Technology's website, soon to be rechristened the National Broadband Resource Center. But I and a group of graduate students did a survey of people without telephones in the state of Texas. And one of the questions we asked them was, have you heard of the Lifeline Lookup Program? Some people had. Well, how have you heard about the Lifeline Lookup Program? Something like a fifth of respondents said, oh, they'd heard about it through marketing efforts by the carriers. The vast majority, 3/4 or so, said, well, they heard about it from somebody in their social network. So that kind of word of mouth for those kinds of programs is critically important. A second story about this idea of social infrastructure comes from some qualitative research I did when I was at the Pew Internet Project. Yes, they let me do non-data-driven research occasionally at the Pew Internet Project. And we did a study in, I think it was 2001, of internet use and its effect on institutions in 5 cities. And I talked with a guy named Bill Callahan in Cleveland, who was at the time running a sort of a storefront community-based organization that provided computer and internet access and training. And he made the observation to me that when he first started getting people interested in using the internet in his neighborhood, and again, this was 2001 or 2002, that's back when people got those AOL discs in the mail and hung them on their trees around the holiday time, because they didn't really, they either got too many of them or they didn't really know what to do with them. He said in the first year or so of doing the program, he was essentially tech support for people. Some people might adopt at home, but when they needed help, they would call him on the phone, or otherwise get hold of him and walk up into his operation. He said that after a while, he noticed that this was ceasing. And what he discovered was people were no longer calling him, they were calling other people in the neighborhood who had gotten computer literate enough that they could share stories about how to troubleshoot problems with access. So that kind of cultivation of the social infrastructure around adoption really can play a role in technology adoption. That's a theme, actually, that has been prominent in some of the workshops we've held at the FCC in connection with the National Broadband Plan and thinking about adoption, which is to say promote social infrastructure. That leads then to the question of, well, what mechanisms can help build social infrastructure? Rob raised the point from the Silicon Valley conference a week or so ago when Sergey Brin said, it'll become just like electricity. Well, electricity didn't happen overnight, didn't happen without some kind of support of the social infrastructure. Rob alluded to this a little bit, but in some background research I've been doing, the Rural Electrification Administration in the 1930s actually had to send agents out to farms to get farmers to understand how to use electricity. the REA also partnered with General Electric and Westinghouse in marketing campaigns to help stimulate this kind of demand. They had to teach people how to use appliances, what appliances were relevant to them. That goes to a point that Rod made about this notion of doing a competition to promote adoption by rewarding ISPs. I think that's an interesting and provocative idea. I think it's worth considering how to take that one step forward. Don't just reward the ISPs, reward the users for helping to build broadband adoption. So if the design of this sort of contest is to reward the ISPs, it might be worth looking into mechanisms whereby the ISPs help really seed adoption among users and reward users for bringing on other users in some of these less advantaged areas. So I'll just conclude with saying that this notion of developing social infrastructure around adoption and the mechanisms for developing it, I think, is an important way to think about some of these adoption issues. I welcome anybody's input on that issue over the next 100 or so days until we have to deliver the broadband adoption, or the broadband plan to Congress. I'll conclude also just with an observation from Jim's paper about the need for evaluation of these programs. We're definitely aware of that at the FCC. There's been lots of discussion around town about how to get better data into the public domain to help conduct these sorts of evaluation programs, and we're certainly attuned to that. I think some of the issues that Jim points out with the insufficiency of some of the evaluation efforts has a lot to do with available data to conduct the evaluations more than anything else. So with that, I will conclude, and I guess we can open it up to Q&A.
Great.
Thanks, Brad.
Thanks, John. I think if you do a search on the internet for this, you can find it. There's a wonderful ad you can find from the REA back in the 30s or the 40s where they actually had these pictures of refrigerators and what refrigerators could do, and so it seemed to work back then, and they really do it again today. So we've got a fair amount of time for questions. Stephen has the mic, so if you can if you can identify yourself, hold until you get the mic, and
Hi, Rob. Jennifer Simpson, American Association of People with Disabilities. Just want to know how you arrived at that $250 amount to give an ISP for your competition. I mean, why $250?
well, you know, if broadband is priceless, it should have been $250,000. You know, I mean, that amount was somewhat informally arrived at. It was sort of, you know, looking at sort of what some other programs cost. Sort of what would seem to be like a reasonable amount, enough to kind of get them engaged and interested to do it, but not so much that it would provide a windfall. And if the FCC were to go forward with this, or Congress, the first thing I would suggest would be look at that number and, you know, start talking to a few more people. Is it exactly the right number? So it was somewhat of an estimate.
Hi, Lee Cohen with Verizon. There's a little bit of discussion, and you mentioned it briefly, Rob, of the literacy, not digital literacy, but literacy issue. And I know it's a tough one to talk about, but there are a lot of literacy challenges in cities, especially. And very high levels of people in some categories couldn't really use a computer well. They probably could use a cell phone now, because in many cases that's a lot more seamless and easy to use. So I'm wondering about literacy as an issue too. How you mentioned a program in Canada, but it's really a tougher challenge than that. So, you know, the idea that we're going to have 100% on is probably going to be tough just because of that issue alone.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody, Jim or anyone else, wants to comment on that.
I'll make a comment, Link. Is this on? Yeah. Yeah, I think that you raise a great point, because I think digital literacy means different things in different areas, and for your example, in urban areas, it's going to be, you know, there are going to be different needs than in rural areas. And so I think that kind of drawing on Jim's paper in terms of his recommendation that comprehensive programs probably are usually the most successful, what we found echoes those results. And if, you know, if you can reach out across different areas, rural and urban, across different demographics, to understand those specific digital literacy needs, and then create specific programs based on those needs, then I think we found that that's usually what is most successful. And it does mean very different things in different areas. The Average Citizen Online, the new program with Intel, that has a strong digital literacy component. And the intent there is to address multiple barriers at once in a more comprehensive way. So to address the digital literacy component, then address the computer ownership issue, address the affordability issue, all in one. So what we found is that it usually works best and is most effective if you're tackling that issue along with others at the same time.
I would just add something, like sort of building on my other point, is I do think this is one of those areas where you're going to do two things at once. You can solve the literacy problem or make it, address it effectively by broadband, which makes it easier for people to use broadband. I mean, I just anecdote from my own life. We adopted a little girl from China who was illiterate. She was 18 months old, didn't know how to write, and she didn't even know how to speak English either. So I don't know what was the problem with it. But anyway, so I found this game on Fisher Price website. And it's a little game. It's a website for infants, believe it or not, and it's this letter game. And I literally within 3 months, she knew every single letter. She'd walk down the street or we'd hold her hand, and not knowing any English even before this, by the age of 21 months, she could identify every single letter. And it's because of this sort of very interactive and fun game that she became addicted to. She would always ask me, and she'd just sit there and press the button, and didn't need to know any language, just saw, A, alligator. So the technology, I think, can play a big role here, not just for an 18-month-old, but for adults as well.
Rob, can I add?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, can I add something here?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. One of the things that we mentioned just briefly in the paper is that I think we can actually, on the subject of general literacy, I think we can actually take a lot of hope from the 20th century experience of the real social success that we had in this country with, to a large extent, conquering the problem of illiteracy. If you look at what literacy rates were at the first part of the 20th century versus today, yes, there are populations for whom this is still a problem, but in absolute percentage terms, almost everybody is literate now in the United States. How did that happen? Well, free public school education had a lot to do with that. So with programs like the E-rate and so forth that get computers into schools, hopefully even those in the poorest or most disadvantaged communities can start to build that stock of net literacy or digital literacy as well. Of course, we always want it to happen faster than it might otherwise do, so that's where the policy comes in. But I think actually there's great hope here for solving this problem.
Thanks. Yeah.
Rich Clark with AT&T. Jim, you talked about the need for cost-benefit analysis, and everybody's been kind of picking up on the term and deriding the idea that anything is priceless. Now, it is possible, certainly, to do a type of cost-benefit analysis where you compare different programs and see how, in competition with each other and see which one gave the most bang for the buck. But that's only kind of half of what cost-benefit analysis is. Part of it is determining, well, what's the maximum price you would be willing to pay to achieve a certain amount of increment in broadband. And I haven't seen anyone yet address this question about, well, what is the maximum amount that we should be willing to pay to advance broadband? And it's not just a question for you, but for any panelist who can try to shed light on that issue.
$250 per person. Go ahead, Jim.
Sorry, I can't see your lips, Rob. I guess the one thing I can say, Rich, is that to the extent that econometric studies have attempted to estimate demand for broadband, that gives a sense of what willingness to pay might be, at least for a certain type of user, the ones that we actually see entering the market. It is much harder to know what would it be worth, or what should the social value be, what value should we place on getting one more person on the internet from a group that really we don't have any demand experience to work with. But you're right, you can focus, you can say, well, whatever it's worth to get someone online, we can certainly look at programs that are more effective or cheaper at doing that. But you're right, that is only half of the problem.
Let me just add one piece to that. But actually, I have two pieces. The vast majority of Washington decision-making is made in the absence of cost-benefit analysis, and so it's almost like the exception to the rule. Shocked that there's gambling going on here. And the second point I would argue is this is, Jim, close your ears for this one, okay? Because you're not going to like. There is a really very good book by Eric Bernholzer that just came out. Digital Wired for Innovation. Thank you. So we had an event with him, and one of the things in his book, he cites some research that shows that the spillover effect of using IT in enterprises is 100%. So the enterprise gets $1 worth of value, the society gets $1 worth of value, so there's underinvestment. I'm sort of happy to say that's probably the case in broadband. Good enough for me. So that suggests that on an average user paying $30 a year on broadband, that the spillover is $360 in 1 year. So again, I would never sort of say that's science, but it suggests that we can and should do more than what we're doing. John?
Sure. Just an observation.
Another way to look at this is the notion of the cost of digital exclusion rising for people. Again, this is one that's difficult to quantify. Any tips on how to do so, I would be more than welcome hearing them. But if you think about the cost, if you think about the digital divide over a 10-year time horizon, 10 years ago, if you were offline, it really wasn't that consequential, right? If you didn't have broadband, there were tons of offline alternatives still. Think about job search. 10 years ago, when you wanted to do a job search, you activated your social networks. Some of that was through the internet, but less than half people had the internet at that point. A lot of it was just by going to newspapers and checking out ads and so forth. Today, the story is very different. If you're going to activate your social network, that pretty much has to be done online these days. If you're going to search for a job, over 3/4 of Fortune 500 companies only take applications online. So the cost of digital exclusion is rising, and you could give examples in other domains as well. And that makes the inequality aspects of being offline more dramatic than they were just a couple of years ago. So that's another way to think about the social cost and benefits to this problem.
Sylvia Rosenthal, Alliance for Public Technology, soon to be National Broadband Resource Center. I have a question primarily for you, John. I know in the 706 inquiry years ago, the commission ran into a problem collecting data because of proprietary information. Are you running into barriers now in data collection, and if so, what are they?
It's a good question. On being fairly new to the FCC, I sort of have a limited window on this. I'll say one thing on data collection. The broadband plan is running a survey of Americans, a national random digital telephone survey of individuals. It's going to help us a lot in thinking through this issue of what the barriers are more. That survey will be made public. The legislation requires that it be made public. So on that basis, there will be data gathered that will be made public and shared with the public. In terms of gathering data to do the plan, we are purchasing data from various vendors. We do have 477 form data that is data that has been improved in its collection over time. Some of that can be made public, some of it can't. So we're doing our best to bring a lot of data into the agency, analyzing that, publishing the results based off of it. You can't make a single bit of data public, but we're certainly going to try our best to make everything public that we can and be as transparent as we can be in the process.
Do you want to also mention the October census?
That's right. Rob and I were talking about this earlier. The NTIA has some questions on broadband use in current population survey supplement. I think it's in the field, or probably just came out of the field, that they'll have data on that, I think late this year, more likely early next year. And that's going to be a tremendous resource. You get 60,000 observations. You can do state-level analysis, something that a national telephone survey can't do. So that's going to be another tremendous resource that will be publicly available.
Although I would add, as we talked about this morning, the census is also putting broadband questions in the American Community Survey. But unfortunately, the plan for that is to not be in the field until 2013. So we can just go on record to say that's too late, and they should get that in the field a lot sooner. There seems to be no reason why we shouldn't be getting that data a lot sooner. Waiting until 2014 or 15 for these results seems like too long to wait. Other comments or questions? We have time for both. One more. Okay. Great. With that, thank you for your attention, and I want to please join me in thanking three great panelists and speakers today. Jim, you can go back to bed now.